Look, this isn't about making a bad decision. It's about making a decision that feels adult. Around 27, something shifts. You're no longer experimenting. You're no longer figuring things out. People start using different words. Stable, settled, responsible. And without realizing it, you start feeling pressure to lock things in. Most people don't remember a single moment where they chose their future. It happens in pieces. You upgrade something. You commit to something. You choose predictability over flexibility. Just this once. And every time it feels reasonable. At 27, you're not thinking about your 50s. You're thinking about relief. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from feeling behind. Relief from explaining yourself. Here's the strange part. The decision that causes the most damage later rarely feels risky at the time. It feels like maturity. It feels like you're finally doing what you're supposed to do. Everyone around you reinforces it. Parents relax. Friends nod approvingly. Coworkers stop questioning your choices. No alarms go off. And that's why most people don't notice this happening. Because nothing breaks. Life keeps moving. Paychecks keep coming. You feel fine. Until one day, much later, you realize something feels heavy. Not chaotic, not desperate, just heavy. Your life works. But it doesn't move easily. And when you try to trace that feeling back, you don't land on a crisis. You land on a decision you barely remember making. That's what makes this uncomfortable. Because if you asked your 27-year-old self, "Are you ruining your future?" they'd laugh. They were being careful. They were being smart. They were doing what made sense. And yet, decades later, that same decision quietly shapes what's possible and what isn't. Most people don't notice this path forming. They only notice it once it's already underneath them. I'm Sheldon. I spend most of my time analyzing how ordinary financial decisions quietly decide people's futures, usually without them realizing it. Not dramatic moves, not risky bets. The calm, reasonable choices people make when they're just trying to feel secure. If you've ever made what felt like a responsible decision in your late 20s, only to notice years later that your life feels heavier instead of freer, that changing direction feels expensive, even when nothing is technically wrong. This is probably about you, because most people don't get stuck by doing something foolish. They get stuck by committing too early. Here's the thing. When you're 27, stability feels like progress. Anything that reduces uncertainty feels like maturity. And once you commit to something, financially, emotionally, structurally, your future starts organizing itself around that decision. Before we go on, tap the like button. It helps this video reach people who are quietly questioning decisions they made years ago. And if this way of thinking resonates with you, subscribe. This channel exists to help you see the paths you're building before they fully harden. Now let's talk about the decision itself. Because once you see it clearly, you'll understand why it feels so right early on, and so limiting later. The decision isn't reckless. It's not about overspending. It's not about chasing status. It's not about ignoring reality. It's about locking in a permanent lifestyle before you actually know your long-term direction. Around 27, many people make the same move. They commit to a structure that assumes their future will be linear. A long-term lease, a mortgage, a lifestyle that requires their current income and effort to continue without interruption. On the surface, this looks responsible. You're not drifting anymore. You're building something. But here's the subtle mistake. You're building before you've explored enough to know what kind of structure you actually need. At 27, your career is still volatile. Your interests are still evolving. Your tolerance for stress isn't fully known yet. But the decision assumes stability. It assumes your income will rise steadily, that your energy will remain high, that your priorities won't shift dramatically. And sometimes that's true, but often it isn't. The problem isn't the commitment itself, it's the timing. When you lock in high fixed costs early, you're making a long-term bet on your future self. You're betting they'll want the same life, that they'll have the same capacity, that they'll be okay carrying this weight for decades. Most people don't consciously make this bet. They tell themselves, this is just the next step. Everyone does this. I can always adjust later. But adjustments get harder once obligations stack. Because fixed costs don't care how you feel. They don't shrink when you're tired. They don't pause when you want to change direction. At 27, the commitment feels like security. At 35, it feels like responsibility. At 45, it feels like obligation. At 50, it often feels like exhaustion. Not because the decision was wrong in isolation, but because it was made before flexibility had done its job. Now you might be thinking, so what's the alternative? Stay unstable forever? No. The issue isn't commitment. It's premature permanence. It's turning something temporary into something fixed before you fully understand what it will cost you over time. This is why this decision doesn't ruin your future overnight. It reshapes it slowly, quietly. By the time the consequences are obvious, your life is already organized around them. And to understand why almost everyone makes this choice, we need to talk about the psychology pushing them toward it. Here's the thing. At 27, uncertainty feels like failure. Not because it actually is, but because the social signals change. You're no longer compared to students. You're compared to peers who seem settled. So when someone commits early, it doesn't just look responsible. It looks safe. The first psychological force at play is social proof. You look around and see people signing leases, buying homes, upgrading their lifestyle. And even if you're not competing, your brain starts asking, why am I still flexible when everyone else seems decided? Staying open begins to feel like falling behind. The second force is identity pressure. Commitment becomes a signal to others and to yourself. It says, I'm serious. I've figured things out. I belong here. Choosing not to lock things in can feel like refusing adulthood. Then there's future optimism bias. At 27, most people assume their future self will be more capable than their present one. More energy, more income, more tolerance. So they commit assuming things will get easier. Sometimes they do, but often life adds complexity instead of removing it. Careers plateau. Stress accumulates. Responsibilities multiply. And suddenly, the structure that felt safe starts to feel heavy. Another powerful force is fear of regret, but not the kind people expect. People aren't afraid of making the wrong decision. They're afraid of not making the decision everyone else made. They imagine a future where they didn't commit early and think, what if I missed my chance? So they lock things in, not because it's right for them, but because it protects them from imagined regret. Finally, there's comfort bias. Predictability reduces anxiety in the short term, even if it costs you later. And when you combine all of this, social approval, identity reinforcement, optimism about the future, fear of missing out, you get a decision that feels almost impossible to question, which is why it usually isn't. And once it's made, the rest of your life quietly organizes itself around it. To see how powerful that is, we need to follow this decision across time. Let's follow the path most people take. Same age, same intention, same sense of responsibility. In the short term, everything feels right. The commitment brings relief. Life feels organized, predictable, approved. Bills are higher but manageable. You tell yourself this is just what adulthood costs. There's even a sense of pride. You've arrived. You're no longer floating. And because nothing goes wrong immediately, your brain files this decision as a success. Now move forward a few years. In the medium term, the structure starts asking for consistency. Your fixed costs are no longer just numbers. They're expectations. You need your income to keep showing up. You need your energy to stay high. You need your tolerance for stress to remain stable. Small changes start to feel bigger. A job you don't love feels harder to leave. Taking a risk feels irresponsible. Time off feels expensive. You still feel functional, but less flexible. You begin optimizing around obligations instead of possibilities. And you don't panic. You adapt, which is exactly the problem. Because adaptation hides cost. Now push the timeline further, into your 40s, into your early 50s. In the long term, the weight becomes clear. Not dramatic failure, fatigue. You've spent decades supporting a structure built by your 27-year-old self. A version of you that assumed constant upward momentum. You still earn. You still pay. You still show up. But change feels exhausting. Not because you're incapable, but because so much of your life is already committed. Your calendar is full. Your income is allocated. Your margin is thin. When opportunities appear, they feel disruptive instead of exciting. You tell yourself it's too late to change. Not because it actually is, but because the cost of change feels unbearable. And here's the quiet tragedy. Nothing went wrong. You weren't reckless. You weren't irresponsible. You simply committed too early, and then spent decades maintaining that commitment. This path doesn't explode. It tightens. And by the time you realize it, you're standing inside a life that works, but no longer moves easily. Now, here's what makes this truly uncomfortable. There's another path. Same age. Same uncertainty. But a different decision at the same moment. Now let's follow the other path. Same age. Same uncertainty. Same external pressure. But instead of locking in permanence, this person keeps optional structures. They choose commitments that can adapt. Shorter leases. Lower fixed costs. A lifestyle that doesn't assume a perfectly linear future. In the short term, this feels uncomfortable. Not unstable, just unfinished. There's less approval, fewer signals of arrival. Some people quietly question their choices, and internally they feel that pressure too. But there's also something else. Breathing room. Unexpected costs don't cause panic. Career changes don't feel catastrophic. Time still feels negotiable. Now move forward. In the medium term, flexibility starts paying quiet dividends. This person can say no. They can walk away from environments that drain them. They can take lateral moves without fear, not because they're braver, but because their life doesn't demand constant performance. They still commit to things, just not prematurely. And because of that, when they do commit, it's informed. They've tested their stress tolerance. They've learned what kind of structure they thrive in. They know what they're willing to carry long term. Now fast forward, into their 40s, into their 50s. In the long term, the difference is obvious. This person isn't free of responsibility, but responsibility doesn't dominate their life. Their expenses leave room. Their calendar has flexibility. Their energy isn't permanently allocated. Change still requires effort, but it doesn't require dismantling their entire life. Opportunities feel interesting instead of threatening. And here's the key distinction. This person didn't avoid commitment. They delayed permanence until it was earned by clarity. They didn't build early. They explored first. Same intelligence, same effort, same starting line. Radically different experience by midlife. And once you see these two paths side by side, there's a realization waiting. Here's the uncomfortable realization. This wasn't about ambition, or laziness, or intelligence. Both people wanted stability. Both wanted to do the right thing. Both believed they were being responsible. The difference wasn't character. It was when permanence entered the picture. One person mistook early commitment for progress. The other treated commitment as something to earn through clarity. And because the first path looked more adult early on, it received more approval. That approval mattered. It made the decision feel settled, final, beyond questioning. By the time doubt appeared, the structure was already built. This is why midlife frustration feels so confusing. You didn't make a reckless choice. You followed the script. And when following the script leads to exhaustion, you don't know where to place the blame. So you internalize it. You assume you should be more grateful, more disciplined, more resilient. But the problem was never effort. It was architecture. Your life was designed around assumptions made too early about energy, income, identity, and desire. And architecture is hard to change once walls are up. This is why people in their 50s often say things like, "I did everything right. I don't know how I ended up here. I thought things would feel easier by now." They're not describing failure. They're describing the weight of decisions that quietly removed flexibility long before it was needed. The realization isn't that commitment is bad. It's that premature permanence is expensive. And once you see that clearly, the question changes. It stops being, "How do I fix my life?" and becomes, "What assumptions am I still carrying that no longer serve me?" Here's a simple rule most people never hear at the right time. Not because it's complicated, but because it goes against what feels responsible early in life. Every permanent commitment you make too early is a future you stop exploring. Not just financially, emotionally, professionally, energetically. When you lock your life into a fixed structure before you truly know yourself, your future doesn't collapse. It just quietly narrows. That's why the decision made at 27 doesn't ruin your 50s in an obvious way. It reshapes them. By the time you reach midlife, you're not dealing with one bad choice. You're dealing with decades of assumptions that no longer fit. Assumptions about how much energy you'd have, how much certainty you'd want, how long you'd be willing to carry the same weight. Most people don't fail financially. They don't fail at life either. They simply commit to a version of themselves too early and then spend years maintaining it. The people who feel lighter later on aren't the ones who avoided responsibility. They're the ones who delayed permanence until clarity showed up. Because clarity changes what commitment should look like. If this made you rethink a decision you once thought was harmless, subscribe. And if you haven't left a like yet, don't forget to tap the thumbs up. It helps this video reach people who need to hear this. Awareness doesn't undo the past, but it gives you control over what comes next. And that's where real freedom actually starts.